Thank you very much, Sema. I'm pleased to welcome here Dr. Yannick TIMMER of the International Monetary Fund. He is one of the most renowned young scholars in the world. I think you were voted in the top 20 young economists in the world, weren't you, Yannick? He has obtained his PhD from Ireland, and he has been a visiting student at Princeton University. Prior to his job at the IMF, he has worked at the Deutsche Bundesbank and the Central Bank of Ireland. And today, Yannick is going to share his thoughts with us on dollar dominance and external adjustments. His speech is going to be focused on the extensive use of the dollar, as the title suggests, and how firms set prices for international trade and in their funding domain, also the dominant currency financing, which has come to the forefront of policy debates, and this has raised questions about how exchange rates actually work and what are the benefits of exchange rate flexibility. Actually, a very nice continuation of the previous talk by Professor Skidelsky, where he touched upon the inability of European firms to change their exchange rates. And in his talk, he's going to document some of these features of the international trade system and finance and explore their implications. So thank you very much in advance, Yannick. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to present here on dollar dominance and external adjustment. So as you said, I'm trying to summarize a little bit, what the dominance of the dollar means for how exchange rate can act as a shock absorber. And this work draws quite heavily on work that I have been doing at the IMF. But of course, these views that I'm going to express are mine and not those of the IMF. So let me start with the way we usually thought about how external adjustment works when there are movements in the currency. So usually we thought that export prices are set in the exporter's currency. So for example, when there's an exporting firm in Turkey, that they set their prices in the Turkish lira. At the same time, while some sovereigns have borrowed in US dollars, we usually assume that firms' financing is also in the local currency. So what does that mean for the way exchange rate fluctuations cause changes in the trade balance? It means that when there is a depreciation in the exchange rate, that it becomes cheaper for foreigners to buy the goods, and that leads to an increase in the exports. And at the same time, depreciation in the exchange rate means that it becomes more expensive for the importers to import, leading overall to an increase in the trade balance through the typical expenditure switching mechanism. So what that means is that when there's a depreciation in the exchange rate, that is a key mechanism for buffering macroeconomic shock and for correcting external imbalances by also increasing competitiveness. However, these two assumptions, that export prices are set in the exporter's currency and that actually firms finance in local currency, when you look at the empirical evidence, it's not so clear that this is always the way it is done. Actually, it is the case that a lot of the pricing is in another currency, in the dominant currency, which is often the US dollar. And also firms are borrowing more and more in US dollars. And what the question then really is this is the case and not that exporters set their prices in their own currency. And if the firms don't borrow in their local currency, what does that mean actually when there is a depreciation or an appreciation in the exchange rate? And how do these two things interact in the way that if the firms borrow more in foreign currency and price in domestic currency or the other way around. So let me first show you some evidence that a lot of firms are actually pricing their exports in US dollars. So here you can see that on the x-axis, the exports to the United States, and on the y-axis, the exports invoiced in US dollars. And it's the case that usually firms, they invoice much more in US dollars than they export to the US, which means that there's some kind of overrepresentation in the invoicing in US dollars. So in which countries or which firms in which countries are doing that, you can see in the euro area, that's of course not so much the case, because in the euro area, the trade is often invoiced in euro. Of course, the US is invoicing a lot in US dollars, but it's particularly pronounced for emerging market economies and developing markets. So what does it mean when the prices are actually set in US dollars? So what that means is if there is a depreciation in the bilateral exchange rate, that actually doesn't really change the prices so much, and doesn't really lead to a strong response in the exports. At the same time, what you can see is if there is a depreciation in the US dollar, the prices in the domestic currency actually go up. But since they are priced in US dollars, for the foreigners, it's not getting cheaper, at least in the short run, to import these goods, which means that it's not more attractive for the foreigners to import from the countries that have just depreciated. So this is on the prices. And now on the right side, I'm going to show you the quantities. So how do exports and how do imports react when there's a depreciation in the exchange rate? So what you can see is if the invoicing is done in the exporter's currency, you see that exports in response to a depreciation go up and imports go down. So that's the typical Mandel-Fleming expenditure switching mechanism. However, when the prices are in US dollars, you see that imports are falling to the same extent, but exports are actually also falling or are not moving at all. But for sure, you can see that exports are actually not increasing because of what I just described, that when there's a depreciation in the exchange rate and the dollar price is fixed, then for the foreigners, it's getting not more attractive for them to import. In the medium term, then, since the firms are benefiting because they have higher revenues in the domestic currency, you can see that there's an adjustment happening in the kind of traditional way. But in the short run, really what that means is that since both exports and imports decline, and especially this is driven by imports, and exports are not rising, that leads, when there's a depreciation or an appreciation in the US dollar, that leads to reduction in trade overall. So which are the countries that are actually invoicing in US dollars, and how did it change over time? So you can see that it's actually been pretty persistent over time. It has received a lot of attention recently, but you see that for certain countries, so for example, for Japan, Indonesia, and Chile, the invoicing in US dollar over the last couple of decades has actually stayed relatively constant and has stayed pretty high. There are some exceptions. In Turkey, it's the case. It has been very high, and now it has declined, and that has to do with the introduction of the euro. But you can still see that for Turkey, the US dollar share of invoicing is almost the same as the euro. And for the other countries that are not so integrated with the euro area, so Japan, Indonesia, Chile, you see that actually the introduction of the euro didn't really do so much. You cannot really see that there was a decrease in US dollar invoicing when the euro was introduced. So far I've shown you some evidence on manufacturing trade mainly, but we can see over the last couple of years, services trade has become more and more important. And this is especially so the case for advanced economies. So when you here look at this graph, there has been this decoupling since kind of the global financial crisis between the growth in services exports, which have grown faster than the goods exports. You can see that the manufacturing to services export has increased for emerging markets and developing economies. And for advanced economies, it has decreased, which means that for advanced economies, services trade has become more and more important. And now I would like to focus on one specific part of services, which is tourism, because tourism has been particularly hard hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. And usually the way we think about tourism is that actually the prices are set in the domestic currency. And we use some data here from TripAdvisor to see how prices in US dollar change when there's a depreciation of the destination country relative to the US dollar. And you can indeed see that then when there's a depreciation of the destination country relative to the US dollar, the hotel prices are also going down. So what that means is that when the Americans, for example, want to go to the Caribbean and there's an appreciation of the US dollar, hotel prices indeed are now lower for the Americans, and that should increase their demand, and they should travel more to these countries. However, this is only really the prices and the hotels. When you actually then again, like we did before, look at the quantities, it's not necessarily so clear that the bilateral depreciation is more important than the US dollar. So what we show here is to what extent the tourist arrivals react to movements in the bilateral exchange rate and to the exchange rate between the origin country and the US dollar. So let me give you an example here. So for example, when you are in Germany and you're thinking about going to Mexico, what we usually think you should look at is what the Mexican peso does relative to the euro. So when the euro appreciates, it should get cheaper for you to go to Mexico, and more Germans would go to Mexico. You can see that indeed it is the case when there's a bilateral depreciation of the origin country. So in that case, Germany, relative to the Mexican peso, then the German tourists are coming less to Mexico. Of course, that's the other way around as well. When there's an appreciation of the euro, then they would go more. However, you see that the effect is even stronger of the euro versus the US dollar. So when the euro appreciates against the US dollar, that's even more important for the German tourists going to Mexico in this regression specification when there's a bilateral move in the exchange rate between the euro and the Mexican peso. So what could be a potential reason for that? One reason is that, while hotel prices seem to be set in the local currency, that's not always the case. And more there are other reasons why travelers are going to the country. So for example, Airbnb prices may be actually set in US dollars. Also, airfares are set in US dollars. So in the end, it really matters how the country that you're coming from, how this exchange rate moves relative to the US dollar, even to a stronger extent to compare to what the bilateral exchange rate is doing. So now let's go into the financing of these firms. So you can see that especially in emerging market economies, and that is also relatively stable over time, financing of firms has been quite significantly been done in US dollars. So in emerging markets, you can see that around 30% of the non-financial corporate debt is actually in US dollars. That's less so for advanced economies, but still around 10% of the financing is done in US dollars. And so when you look at the right-hand side graph, you can see there's quite a lot of variation. Countries like Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey have pretty high shares of foreign currency financing, while others have less. And you can also see here that emerging markets have much more on average than advanced economies. When you look at then the breakdown between debt securities and loans, it also really varies across countries. In Turkey, for example, you can see that a lot of it is actually in loans and less so in debt securities. So what does that mean when the firm that is importing and exporting is at the same time also financing their working capital with US dollars relative to the domestic currency? So what that means is that when there's a depreciation in the local currency relative to the US dollar and the debt is invoiced in US dollars, that means that your debt repayments are going up and your net worth is automatically going down. So you have this net worth shock in response to depreciation when you borrow more in foreign currency. So what does this net worth shock mean? So here we show that countries that borrow quite heavily in US dollar in response to a depreciation, they contract their imports much more than firms that borrow less in foreign currency. So, and one way to rationalize this is that since there's this net worth shock, or the negative net worth shock, that the firms actually, you know, the interest rates, the risk of these firms is going up, the interest rates are going up, and they have a harder time to borrow, and they are less able to import. When you then actually look at exports, the pattern looks quite different. So let's look at first the very right chart here, where you see that when there is US dollar invoicing, there is actually almost no impact of depreciation on exports. So why is that the case? Wouldn't you think that when imports are going down, that exports are also going down more when the firms are borrowing in foreign currency? And no, that's not the case. And the main reason for that is that these firms that are exporting, as I said before, when they price in US dollars and there's a depreciation in the exchange rate, that actually increases their revenues in domestic currency. So it acts as a natural hedge. The depreciation acts as a natural hedge when you're exporting, because your revenues go up and your debt goes up. So the two, to some extent, offset each other, which then allows these firms not to have to reduce their exporting. This is not the case when actually firms are invoicing in the domestic currency. You can see that firms that have a lot of FX debt, but are invoicing in the local currency, they reduce their exports more. And the reason for that is that they are not hedged, because their export revenues are not automatically in domestic currency going up when there is a depreciation in the exchange rate, because they rely on essentially the expenditure switching in the other country, which is not happening immediately. So this evidence I've shown you about the financing currency has been on a cross-country setting. One problem with that is that you cannot really disentangle the firms that are only importing and the firms that are importing and exporting. And in order to do that and use more granular information on the firms, we look at the case of Colombia, where we have very detailed data available on around 22,000 Colombian firms. And we look at one kind of exogenous decrease in the depreciation in the Colombian peso to study this channel that I've highlighted just in the cross-country setting. So let me show you what the Colombian peso did relative to the US dollar during this period. So what you can see is that in 2014, there was a very strong depreciation of the peso relative to the US dollar. And at the same time, the imports and the exports of Colombian firms dropped quite significantly. And what we make use of here is that this depreciation of the Colombian peso was really mainly driven by a drop in the oil price. In Colombia, it's the case there are few firms that are exporting very large quantities of oil, and they drive a lot of the exchange rate movement when there are changes in the oil price. However, the other firms in the country are actually relatively unrelated to these few very, very big firms. And when we here on the left-hand side plot the imports and the exports, these are actually the non-oil exports. And you see that even there it is the case that the imports and the exports are dropping quite significantly. And what we're really asking here is to what extent this financial channel, the foreign currency borrowing can explain this drop in the imports. And mirroring the results that I showed you in the cross-country, it is the case that when there is this depreciation in the Colombian peso relative to the US dollar, there is a very strong response in the imports, and even more so for the firms that are borrowing in foreign currency. Exports, on the other hand, are actually not responding. When you then split the sample between firms that are non-exporters and that are exporters, you see that this drop in imports is exclusively driven by the firms that are non-exporters. And the imports of exporters, and that's what we couldn't show in the cross-country setting, is the response is completely muted. And why is that the case? The reason for that is that, again, that the exporters, they don't need to reduce the imports, because when there's a depreciation, the revenues in Colombian peso are going up when they're exporting. And of course, the importers, they don't have this hedge, and that's why they need to reduce the import. One advantage of this data set is that we can also actually look at the interest rates that the firms have to pay on their loans. And again, you see that the non-exporters that borrowed more in foreign currency, they have to pay much higher interest rates during and after the depreciation of the Colombian peso, while the exporters, they actually do not have to pay higher interest rates. And why is that the case? Again, because the revenues are going up and they are hedged, and the banks are not charging high interest rates because their default probabilities are just not going up so much because they're hedged. So how would the evolution of the imports here and of the exports look like if there wouldn't have been any foreign currency borrowing, or if there would have been more foreign currency borrowing? And that's what we show here. So we can see that when the depreciation is happening, there is this drop in imports, and then we can move around depending on the counterfactual, how much foreign currency borrowing can then explain of this drop in imports. So you see that, for example, when in the hypothetical scenario, if firms wouldn't have any foreign currency leverage, then the drop in imports would have been actually much smaller. And this is exactly what we would expect under a scenario where there's no foreign currency borrowing. At the same time, Colombian firms could have even borrowed more in foreign currency, and in that case, the imports would have dropped even more. So these are really kind of sizable macro effects. I think without foreign currency leverage, you can see that the drop in imports would be around 17% less. Drop would be 17% less than when under the actual scenario. So let me conclude. What we can see is that dominant currency pricing and dominant currency financing interact, and under dominant currency pricing, when there is a depreciation in the exchange rate, usually we think that through the expenditure switching channel can boost exports, but actually, if there's a lot of dominant currency pricing, that is not so much the case. At the same time, when firms borrow in foreign currency, the impact of exporting firms is not very large, but it amplifies the import response for the firms that are not exporting and are borrowing in foreign currency. Overall, that means that the kind of the benefits of exchange rate flexibility in absorbing the macro shock are much weaker than we thought under traditional Mandel-Fleming model. So what can we really do? So there are kind of ex ante and ex post policies that can be implemented on the one hand to prevent these kind of negative side effects on the financial market, it could be possible to develop hedging markets a bit better so that firms can actually hedge this risk. So for example, when they borrowed in foreign currency, that their debt values are going up, they could buy FX derivatives in order to hedge themselves. And at the same time, when it's already too late, it may be beneficial for the central bank to step in and provide support to the firms that are struggling. Of course, then you have to be careful with moral hazard issues. Let me talk 1 second about COVID. What we saw when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out is that there was a huge drop in trade, mainly, of course, because of the collapse in global demand and the breakdown of global supply chains. But at the same time, you could also see that at the very beginning, there was an appreciation of the US dollar. And usually you would think that when the emerging market economies that have been hit, they're depreciating, that would mean that there's an offsetting effect and the exports would increase. But if it's actually the case that they're invoicing in US dollars, that's not really the case. And actually the appreciation of the US dollar would actually mean an even stronger drop in trade than we would have expected under producer currency pricing. At the same time, due to the depreciation of the domestic currency and the appreciation of the dollar, a lot of firms in emerging market economies got under pressure because the debt values really went up, which then had additional negative effects on the imports. One other interesting component is that usually in tourism, it is the case that the depreciation actually help attract tourists, but of course, under COVID, that wasn't the case. Overall, what that means is really that it's important to provide a support to the economy, and that overall kind of the benefits of the exchange rate depreciation have to be questioned, and we really need to take that into account in our policy advice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yannick, for your insightful talk. I'm screening the YouTube channel, but I cannot see any questions there. And I was just informed as well also by one of the co-organizers that there are no questions. Just one quick question from me before we end today's session. Okay, in terms of the policy implications, I can completely understand why you're going with, ex post and ex ante hedging strategies and central bank interventions when it comes to that. But the question that I've got for you is, why should these, let's say, Mexican or Colombian enterprises fund their activities in US dollars when they can borrow in the local pesetas or pesos without the exchange rate risk on top of that, since they've got that, exchange rate flexibility as well?
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, what we can see is that sometimes in order to do the importing, they actually need to borrow in US dollars because they pay in US dollars. So that's why it can actually be beneficial for them. At the same time, it is also the case that borrowing in US dollars is often cheaper for these firms. So you can see that some firms actually borrow in US dollars, and you would think that it's not necessarily the case that these firms that are borrowing in US dollars, they would hedge themselves because they are on purpose taking the risk. But you can see that some firms actually do borrow in US dollars, potentially to use it as kind of a vehicle to import. And then at the same time, they hedge the currency risk, which then actually does hedge them, as derivatives are supposed to do, from the depreciation and from the revaluation channel, that they don't have to restrict their imports to the same extent as the firms that borrow more in foreign currency, but do not use these FX derivatives.
Okay, thank you. I think we are running out of time, so I'm not going to go on with more questions. But thank you so much for your very insightful and very data-rich presentation. It has been a great pleasure, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in journals.
Thank you very much for the invitation. That was really a pleasure.
Thank you. Is good?
Yes, thank you very much for your support also. This is the end of this session. Take care yourself.
Yeah, thank you. See you later. Bye.
Bye.